He saw a young Apache girl hanging from a tree. The note she held changed lives. The Arizona Territory in the year of 1879 was a land that broke men as easily as it broke horses. It was a place where the sun didn't warm, it punished, where the earth cracked open like old wounds that refused to heal, and where Jedediah Stone rode, there was nothing but silence and the weight of things left undone. He was tracking cattle that day, strays that had wandered too far from his small ranch, pulled by the promise of water that didn't exist. The cottonwood flats stretched before him, a graveyard of dried riverbeds and skeletal trees. His horse moved slowly, and Jedediah's eyes scanned the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who had learned that survival meant seeing trouble before trouble saw you. Then he saw her, a shape, suspended, swaying slightly in the hot wind. He urged his horse forward, his pulse hammering. The ancient mesquite tree stood alone, twisted and massive, and from those branches she hung, an Apache woman, young. Her body limp, a sun-dark shadow, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had worn through skin to bone. Her head hung forward, black hair obscuring her face, breathing in shallow, broken gasps. But it was the sign above her that made Jedediah's blood turn cold. A raw plank of wood, nailed crudely to the trunk, bore a message in paint the color of dried blood. White man doesn't forgive. The woman made a sound, a broken whimper that carried across the distance like a prayer. His sister had made a sound like that, in the raid, when he had been too late to save her. Jedediah dismounted and pulled his hunting knife. His hand trembled as he cut through the rope. The woman dropped into his arms, light as kindling and burning with fever. He knew what carrying her meant. He was marking himself, making himself a target. But he wrapped her in his bedroll, secured her across his saddle, and turned his horse toward his ranch, toward the unknown, toward a future that had just split open like lightning through dark clouds. The ride back to his ranch stretched across 12 miles of unforgiving terrain. Jedediah kept the woman pressed against his chest, feeling each shallow breath she took, each fevered tremor that passed through her body. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the air into something thick and suffocating. He gave her water from his canteen, tilting it carefully to her cracked lips, watching as most of it ran down her chin. She was somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, her body present but her spirit wandering in places he couldn't follow. His ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage that refused to disappear. A single modest cabin constructed from weathered timber and adobe, a small barn that leaned slightly to the east, and a corral that housed 2 horses and the dream of cattle that might one day make this land profitable. It was his sanctuary, his fortress against the chaos of the territory, and now he was bringing that chaos directly through his front door. He dismadged carefully, cradling the woman as though she were made of glass and gunpowder. Inside the cabin the air was cooler, shadowed, smelling of leather and wood smoke and the loneliness that had been his only companion for 3 years. He laid her on his cot, the only bed in the single room, and began the work of assessing her injuries. Her wrists were raw, carved deep by the rope, the flesh angry and weeping. Her body was covered in bruises, some fresh and livid, others fading to the yellow-green of old violence. She had been beaten, starved, left to die slowly under that merciless sun. But she was alive. Her heart still beat. Her lungs still drew air. Jedediah fetched water from the well, clean cloth from his meager supplies, and the tin of salve he kept for horse wounds. He worked methodically, cleaning the wounds on her wrists, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt. He bathed her face, her arms, her feet, washing away layers of dust and dried blood. She didn't wake, didn't acknowledge his touch, but her breathing steadied, and the fever that had made her skin burn began to subside slightly. He had no name for her, knew nothing of who she was or where she came from. But looking at her face, at the strength that persisted even in unconsciousness, at the way her jaw was set with determination even in sleep, he found a word forming in his mind. Ilara. It meant light, strength, something that endured. He sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, and watched her sleep, The solitude he had cultivated so carefully was shattered. The peace he had fought to maintain was already slipping through his fingers like desert sand. Outside, the sun continued its relentless arc across the sky, and somewhere beyond the ridges, the people who had marked this woman for death were still out there, waiting, watching, hunting. The question wasn't if they would come, it was when, and what Jedediah Stone would do when they arrived. The first days passed in a rhythm of careful tending and cautious vigilance. Ilara, he called her that now, though she had given him no name, remained in a state between waking and sleeping. She would sometimes open her eyes, dark and filled with suspicion and fear, but she never spoke, never tried to rise. Her body was healing slowly, but her spirit seemed locked somewhere deep inside, protected by walls he couldn't breach. Jedediah worked the ranch as he always had, but differently now. He kept his rifle closer. His eyes scanned the horizon more frequently. Every dust cloud in the distance made his hand move to his weapon. Every sound of hoofbeats made his heart rate quicken. The territory had a way of carrying news, and he knew that the empty rope and missing girl would not go unnoticed for long. On the fourth day, his fears materialized. The sound of approaching horses pulled him from the barn, where he'd been mending tack. 3 riders, moving at a steady pace, official, deliberate. As they drew closer, Jedediah saw the blue uniforms, the military bearing, the cold efficiency of men who represented law in a lawless land. The leader was a lieutenant, Abraham Lowell. Jedediah had seen him before, in town, a man whose face was carved from righteousness and prejudice in equal measure. He sat tall in his saddle, his uniform immaculate despite the dust, his eyes scanning the ranch with the thoroughness of a man conducting an inspection. Behind him, 2 enlisted men sat with rifles across their laps, their faces blank and ready. Lowell dismounted with the precision of a man who did everything by regulation. He approached Jedediah, who stood in front of his cabin door, positioning his body as a barrier, his face arranged into the neutral mask of a man with nothing to hide. The lieutenant spoke without preamble, his voice carrying the flat authority of military command. He described a fugitive, an Apache woman, dangerous, wanted for murder and escape from custody. He produced a poster from his saddlebag, unfolding it to reveal a crude sketch that could have been any woman, any face, any person the artist's imagination had conjured. The reward was substantial, $200, a fortune for information, a king's ransom for delivery. But it was the way Lowell spoke of her that made Jedediah's jaw tighten. The words he used, savage, animal, creature, not woman, not person, not human. Jedediah met the soldier's gaze without flinching. He had learned to lie in the war, had perfected it in the years since. His face showed nothing but mild curiosity and the honest concern of a man being questioned by authority. He told them he'd seen nothing, had been working his ranch, had found stray cattle in the flats, but nothing else. The desert was full of empty spaces and abandoned things. If someone had been out there, he'd missed them entirely. Lowell's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe, but he had no proof, no evidence, no reason beyond suspicion to press further. The lieutenant remounted, his movements sharp with frustration. He issued a warning. If Jedediah saw anything, he was obligated to report it. Harboring a fugitive was a capital offense. The penalty was hanging, no trial, no mercy. Then they rode away, 3 shapes disappearing into the heat shimmer, leaving only dust and threat behind. Jedediah stood motionless until they were completely gone. Then he turned and entered his cabin, closing the door behind him with careful control. Inside, Ilara sat upright on the cot, her eyes wide and fully alert for the first time since he'd found her. She had heard everything, every word, every threat, every description of her as something less than human. She looked at him with an expression that mixed suspicion with dawning realization. This white man, this stranger, had just lied to the United States cavalry, had just committed treason against his own kind, had just painted a target on his own back. For her. Jedediah crossed the room and knelt beside the cot, bringing himself to her eye level. He didn't speak, didn't try to explain or justify. He simply met her gaze, letting her see whatever truth lived in his eyes. Outside, the sun continued its relentless journey. Inside, the fragile beginning of something like trust began to take root in the silence between two people who had every reason to remain strangers and enemies. The weight of what he'd done settled on Jedediah's shoulders like a yoke. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was an outlaw, a criminal, a man who had chosen the life of a condemned Apache woman over his own safety, his own future, his own survival. And looking at her, at the way she watched him with those dark, evaluating eyes, he found he didn't regret it, not even a little. The days that followed the lieutenant's visit passed in a strange, suspended tension. Elira grew stronger. She began to move around the cabin, tentative at first, testing her healing legs, her body still bearing the marks of her ordeal but recovering with the resilience of someone who had survived worse. She ate the simple food Jedediah prepared, beans, cornbread, dried meat, with the efficiency of someone who understood that food was fuel, not pleasure. But she still didn't speak, not a word, not even when he asked direct questions or tried to communicate through gestures. Her silence was absolute, a wall as impenetrable as the mountains that ringed the territory. Jedediah respected it. He had his own silences, his own walls. He understood that some wounds couldn't be seen and some healings took longer than flesh and bone. He gave her space but remained vigilant. He showed her where the rifle was kept, how to load it, how to fire if needed. He taught her his simple signals. 1 sharp whistle meant danger, 2 meant all clear. She absorbed the information with the focused intensity of someone studying a foreign text that might contain the key to survival. At night, he slept in the barn, giving her the cabin, the privacy, the sanctuary of 4 walls and a locked door. He didn't want her to feel trapped, didn't want her to believe she had merely traded one captor for another. But the territory was restless. News traveled in strange ways across the desert, through travelers at the trading posts, through cowboys riding the range, through the invisible network of gossip and rumor that connected every isolated ranch and settlement. The story of the hanging tree was spreading, the empty rope, the missing prisoner, the growing suspicion that someone had interfered with justice. Jedediah heard whispers when he went to town for supplies, saw the sideways glances, felt the subtle shift in how people regarded him. Suspicion was a living thing in the territory, and once it took root, it grew like mesquite, deep, thorny, impossible to remove. The breakthrough came on the 7th evening. Jedediah was in the barn, tending to his horses, when he heard a sound from outside. Not alarm, not distress, something else. Rhythmic, deliberate. He emerged to find Elira kneeling in the hard-packed dirt near the barn, her back to him, her body curved over something on the ground. He approached slowly, making noise so she would hear him coming, giving her the choice to stop or continue. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence, but she didn't stop either. She was drawing, using a stick, making marks in the dust with the precision of someone creating something sacred. Jedediah stopped a few feet away and looked at what she had made. The image was simple but powerful. A bird, wings spread wide, surrounded by flames. The lines were confident, practiced, the symbol of someone who had drawn this image many times before. He knelt slowly, carefully at the edge of the drawing, his eyes fixed on the firebird. He had seen symbols like this before, on pottery, on blankets, in the ruins of old Apache camps. They carried meaning, story, identity. Then she spoke. Her voice was raspy, roughened by disuse and screaming and all the violence her throat had endured. But it was clear, certain, filled with a grief so deep it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. She told him her true name, Ayana, daughter of a chief whose band had lived peacefully in the canyons north of here, people who had tried to walk the impossible line between their old ways and the new reality of encroaching settlers. Her father had been a man of wisdom, her mother a keeper of songs, her younger brother a boy who loved horses and laughter. 3 months ago, a settler's wife had been found dead near their camp, murdered. The evidence was circumstantial, the accusations immediate. No investigation, no questions. Just the swift, brutal certainty of men who needed someone to blame and had already decided that Apache blood would pay the price. The cavalry had come at dawn, not to arrest, to annihilate. They had burned the camp while people slept, shot those who ran, rounded up those who survived and executed them in a line, one by one, while the smoke still rose from their homes. Ayanna had been captured, marked as the chief's daughter, kept alive not for mercy but for spectacle. They wanted to make an example, wanted other bands to see what happened to those who defied the white man's justice. They had beaten her, starved her, then hung her from that tree as bait, hoping her father or his warriors would come to save her and walk into a trap. But no one had come, because there was no one left to come. She was the last, the only survivor of her entire family, her entire band, 43 people erased from the earth in a single morning. The firebird, she explained, was her father's sign, a symbol of their people's resilience, their refusal to be extinguished, their belief that even from ashes something could rise. Jedediah listened without interruption, didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to soften the horror of what she described. He simply bore witness, let the weight of her story settle into the space between them. When she finished, silence returned. But it was different now. Not a wall, a shared space. Jedediah pressed his calloused hand into the dust beside her drawing. Palm flat, fingers spread, a print, a mark, a pledge written in the same earth that held her firebird. He told her about his sister, Margaret, 8 years younger, full of life and music and the kind of joy that seemed impossible in a hard land. She had stayed at the family cabin while he'd gone to town for supplies. A routine trip, nothing dangerous, nothing that should have gone wrong. But a raiding party had come through, not her people, a different band, desperate, starving, angry at a world that was crushing them. They had taken what little the cabin held and set it ablaze. By the time Jedediah returned, there was nothing left but smoking timbers and a silence that had never left him. He blamed himself, had spent 3 years building this isolated ranch, trying to hide from the guilt that followed him like a shadow, trying to convince himself that solitude was safety, that distance was protection. But saving Ayanna wasn't about redemption. It was about refusing to be the man who rode past, who looked away, who let the world's violence go unanswered because answering was dangerous. Ayanna looked at him with eyes that suddenly saw him differently, not as a white man, not as a rescuer, but as someone who carried the same weight, the same failure, the same desperate need to prevent the past from repeating. She reached out and placed her hand over his in the dust. 2 palms, 2 survivors, 2 people bound by grief and defiance. In the fading light, with the firebird drawn between them, something shifted. The distance collapsed. The walls crumbled. They were no longer stranger and rescued. They were allies, witnesses to each other's pain, partners in a survival that required more than just staying alive. That night, Ayanna returned to the cabin, but Jedediah didn't go to the barn. They sat by the small hearth, tending a fire that pushed back the darkness, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt completely alone. The territory beyond the ranch was still dangerous, the threat still real, the consequences of his choice still waiting. But in that moment, they had created something the violence couldn't touch, a space where 2 people could be seen, could be heard, could be believed. And in a land built on erasure and forgetting, that was its own kind of revolution. The revelation by the firebird drawing changed everything and nothing. The threats remained. The danger still circled like vultures over carrion. But the silence between Jedediah and Ayanna transformed into something else. Communication, connection, understanding. She began to teach him words in her language, simple things at first: water, sky, horse, fire. He repeated them with the clumsiness of someone whose tongue had never shaped those sounds, and she would smile, a rare, fleeting expression that transformed her face from survival to something almost like peace. He taught her more English, though she already understood more than she had initially let on. Her silence had been protection, a way to observe and assess before revealing how much she comprehended. Now she practiced phrases, her accent thick but her meaning clear, her intelligence obvious in how quickly she absorbed and adapted. They worked the ranch together. She had skills he lacked, an intuitive understanding of the land, of which plants held water, which could heal, which could harm. She showed him how to find hidden springs by reading the behavior of birds and insects, how to predict weather by the smell of the air and the way the horses moved. Knowledge passed down through generations, now shared across a divide that was supposed to be uncrossable. Jedediah found himself watching her, the way she moved through the world with a warrior's awareness, never fully relaxed, always positioned where she could see approaches. The way her hands were never idle, always mending, creating, preparing. The way she would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and stare toward the north, toward the canyons where her people had lived, her face holding an expression of loss so profound it made his chest ache. He understood. He had his own north, his own place he couldn't return to, his own ghosts that called to him in the dark hours. One afternoon, while repairing fence line, she asked him about the ranch, why he had chosen this place, this isolation, this life that seemed designed to keep the world at arm's length. He told her the truth. After Margaret's death, he couldn't stay in places where people gathered, couldn't tolerate the noise of towns, the false comfort of community, the way people looked at him with pity or judgment. The ranch was his rebellion against a world that had taken everything. Here, he answered to no one, owed nothing, could exist without explanation or apology. She understood that too. She told him about the impossible position her father had tried to navigate, wanting to preserve their ways while acknowledging the reality of the white man's power, trying to teach his children both the old songs and the new language, believing, against all evidence, that there might be a path forward that didn't require complete erasure. The tragedy was that his wisdom had been rewarded with annihilation. They sat together that evening on the porch, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of copper and blood. The heat of the day was fading, the cool breath of night beginning to rise. And in that liminal space between day and darkness, Ayanna asked him the question he had been avoiding. Why had he really saved her? Not the noble reason, not the right thing to do, but the real reason, the one that came from the deepest part of him. Jedediah was quiet for a long time. Then he told her about the moment he had seen her hanging there, how his first instinct had been to ride away, how he had actually started to turn his horse, how he had heard her whimper and something in him had broken open, something he thought he had sealed shut forever. He had saved her because he was tired of living as a dead man, tired of the isolation that was supposed to protect him but had actually made him a ghost, tired of the safety that felt like slowly drowning. She had given him a reason to fight again, to risk again, to be alive in all the dangerous, terrifying ways that mattered. Ayanna looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. Not gratitude, not affection, something rawer, more honest. She told him that in her culture, when someone saved your life, a debt was created, but not the kind white people understood. It wasn't about owing or obligation. It was about souls becoming intertwined, about destinies being rewritten, about two paths becoming one path. Jedediah felt something shift in his chest, a pressure, an opening, a sense of standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted. The days continued in their new rhythm, but now there were moments of contact. Her hand on his arm when teaching him a word, his steadying grip on her shoulder when she lost balance on uneven ground. Small touches that carried meaning beyond their physical presence. The night it changed, neither of them planned it. They had been working late, organizing supplies in the cabin, preparing for the possibility that they might need to leave quickly. The window was open, bringing in the cool night air and the sound of coyotes singing to the risen moon. Jedediah was reaching for a box on a high shelf when Ayanna stepped close to help steady it. Their shoulders touched. She didn't move away. Neither did he. He turned slowly, the box forgotten, and found her looking up at him. Her face was open in a way he had never seen, vulnerable, questioning, waiting. He raised his hand and touched her face, his palm rough against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing, her breath catching. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told her that he didn't see skin, didn't see the categories and divisions that the world insisted mattered. He saw what breathed beneath, the courage, the strength, the survival, the soul that refused to be extinguished. She opened her eyes and placed her hand over his heart, felt it beating, felt the same thing he had described living inside him too. Their kiss was not gentle, it was desperate, ancient, a defiance against every force that said they should be enemies, against every law that said their connection was forbidden, against death itself, which had tried to claim them both and failed. They held each other in that small cabin, two people who had lost everything, finding something new in the ruins. It wasn't the soft, romantic love of stories. It was the fierce, unbreakable bond of survivors who recognized each other's scars and chose them anyway. But the world outside didn't care about their connection, didn't honor their bond, didn't believe they had the right to choose each other. The next morning, Jedediah saw the dust on the horizon. Not soldiers this time, civilians. A group of riders moving with purpose. He counted 6, maybe 7, local ranchers. Men he recognized from town, led by Thaddeus Prescott, a man whose hatred of Apaches was legendary, whose son had died in a raid 5 years ago, and who had been hunting revenge ever since. They arrived at midday. Prescott dismounted with the confidence of a man who believed God and justice rode with him. He didn't ask permission to search, didn't present warrants or authority. He simply stated his intention. They knew Jedediah was harboring the fugitive. They had heard stories, seen signs, put together pieces, and they were going to search his property whether he agreed or not. Jedediah stood in front of his cabin door, rifle held loosely but ready. He told them this was private property, that they had no right, that if they wanted to search, they could bring the sheriff with proper papers. Prescott smiled. It was a cold expression. He told Jedediah that the territory was tired of waiting for official justice, that good men were taking matters into their own hands, that harboring a murderer made Jedediah as guilty as she was. The standoff lasted an eternity compressed into minutes. 6 men with guns against 1. The mathematics were clear. But Jedediah didn't move, didn't back down, didn't give them an inch. Finally, Prescott remounted, but not in defeat, in promise. He told Jedediah that they would be watching, that he had made his choice and would have to live with the consequences. That justice in the territory had many faces, and not all of them wore badges. As they rode away, Jedediah saw smoke on the distant horizon, not from a chimney, from a signal fire. The old way of spreading news across long distances, the way Apache bands had communicated for generations. But this wasn't a friendly signal. It was a gathering call, a summons, a declaration that the hunt was officially on. Inside the cabin, Ayanna stood at the window, her face set in grim determination. She told him they had to leave. Tonight. Waiting would mean death for them both. Jedediah nodded. He had known this moment was coming, had been preparing for it even while hoping it might be delayed. But hope was a luxury neither of them could afford. They would run, head south toward Mexico, toward the Sierra Madre Mountains where rumor said the free Apache still held territory. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but staying was certain death. As night fell, they gathered what they could carry. Weapons, food, water, the bare essentials of survival. Jedediah took one last look at his cabin, his ranch, the life he had built from nothing. Then he walked away from it without looking back. Because Ayanna had been right. Their souls were intertwined now. Their paths had become one path, and wherever that path led, they would walk it together, or die trying. They rode through the night under a sky so vast and star-filled, it seemed to press down on them with the weight of eternity. Jedediah led, his horse picking its way through the rocky terrain with the sure-footedness of an animal that knew its life depended on not stumbling. Ayanna rode behind him, her body swaying with the horse's rhythm. her eyes constantly scanning their back trail for signs of pursuit. They didn't speak, couldn't risk it. Sound carried strangely in the desert at night, bouncing off rock faces, channeling through canyons in ways that could betray them to ears miles away. So they communicated through touches, a hand on a shoulder, a gesture toward a direction, a shared glance that conveyed more than words could. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles. Jedediah guided them into a narrow canyon where the walls rose steep and protective on both sides, creating a slot of shadow even as the sun climbed. They stopped to rest the horses, to eat jerky and hardtack, to drink sparingly from their canteens. Ayanna climbed to a high point and watched their back trail. When she returned, her face was grim. Dust, still distant, but following, moving with purpose. Jedediah nodded. He had expected it. Prescott wasn't a man who made threats idly, and whoever had lit that signal fire had called in reinforcements. They were being hunted by men who knew this land, who had resources in numbers and the righteousness of believing they were serving justice. They rode on, through the heat of day that turned the air into liquid shimmer, through terrain that grew progressively more brutal, fields of stone that could shred a horse's hooves, arroyos that could trap and kill, stretches of nothing where water was a memory and hope was the only fuel. Ayanna showed her value. She found water where Jedediah would have missed it, read the land with an intuition he didn't possess, guided them through passages that looked impassable, but opened into hidden trails known only to people who had walked this territory for generations. She was leading them home, or to what had been home, to the network of canyons and hidden valleys where Apache bands had survived for centuries before the white man arrived with his maps and his certainty that empty land meant unclaimed land. On the second night, they made the mistake of building a small fire. They needed hot food, needed to boil water to purify it, needed the warmth as the desert temperature plummeted with the sunset. Jedediah kept the fire small, hidden in a depression of rock, the smoke dispersed by an overhang. But it was enough. The attack came just before midnight. Not soldiers, not Prescott's posse, something worse. Bandits, or mercenaries. Men who lived in the spaces between law and chaos, who survived by taking what others had and killing anyone who resisted. 6 of them, maybe more. They came out of the darkness like demons, their faces wrapped in cloth, their weapons ready. Jedediah woke to the sound of a rifle being cocked near his head. He rolled, his hand finding his own gun, and fired blind. The muzzle flash lit up the night like lightning. A man screamed. Others opened fire. The firefight was brutal and close. No strategy, no planning, just violence meeting violence in the dark. Jedediah felt something burn across his ribs. Not a direct hit, a graze, but hot and bleeding and stealing his strength. Ayanna fought like the warrior she had been trained to be. She had taken one of the attacker's rifles and used it with deadly efficiency. Her movements were precise, economical, the product of training that had begun in childhood. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, just fought. The bandits retreated, not because they were beaten, because they hadn't expected this level of resistance. They faded back into the darkness to regroup, to reassess, to plan a better approach. Jedediah and Ayanna didn't wait. They grabbed their gear, mounted their exhausted horses, and ran. Blood dripped from Jedediah's side, leaving a trail in the dust. His vision swam, his grip on the reins weakened, but they rode, through the remainder of the night, through the dawn, through the morning heat that felt like riding through fire. Ayanna kept them moving, kept Jedediah in the saddle when he started to slump, kept their direction true when his fever began to rise and his sense of direction failed. By afternoon, they could hear pursuit again, closer now. The bandits had found their trail and were following with the patience of predators who knew their prey was wounded. But Prescott's posse was out there too. Jedediah saw them once, a line of riders on a distant ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. 2 groups, both hunting, and caught between them. 2 people who represented everything those groups wanted to destroy. The border was close. Mexico, freedom, sanctuary, 10 miles, maybe less. But 10 miles might as well have been 100 with Jedediah losing blood and consciousness, with the horses stumbling from exhaustion, with pursuit closing from 2 directions. Ayanna made a decision. She turned them toward a formation of rock she recognized, a place of power in her people's history, a series of narrow passes and hidden caverns that could be defended by one person against many. It was their only chance. They reached it just as the sun began its descent. Jedediah half fell from his horse. Ayanna caught him, her strength surprising, her determination absolute. She helped him into a narrow cleft in the rock, a space barely large enough for 2 people, but defensible. She tended his wound. The bullet had carved a furrow across his ribs, deep but not fatal if infection didn't set in. She packed it with crushed herbs she had gathered, wrapped it with cloth torn from her own clothing, and gave him water mixed with something bitter that helped with the pain and the fever. Then she positioned herself at the entrance to their shelter, rifle ready, and waited. The bandits arrived first, 5 of them. The one Jedediah had shot was gone, either dead or left behind. They approached cautiously now, having learned respect for their prey's teeth. Ayanna fired once, a warning shot. It ricocheted off rock and whined into the distance. The bandits stopped, assessed. One of them shouted in Spanish, telling them to surrender, promising quick deaths if they cooperated. Ayanna responded in the same language. Her Spanish was rough but clear. She told them what waited if they advanced. She described in detail what she would do to each of them, the places she would shoot that would cause maximum pain before death. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, the voice of someone who had seen death often enough to describe it without emotion. The bandits conferred. Then they began to probe, testing the position, looking for weaknesses, for angles, for opportunities. Ayanna repelled them, not through superior firepower, through superior knowledge. She knew this ground, knew which approaches were vulnerable, which were traps. She fired sparingly, making each bullet count, making each shot a lesson that taught the price of advancing. Hours passed, the sun set, darkness fell, and in that darkness, Prescott's posse arrived. The 2 groups encountered each other in the failing light. There was confusion, shouting. The bandits thought the posse was reinforcements for their prey. The posse thought the bandits were accomplices. Shots were fired. Men died. In the chaos, Ayanna saw their chance. She helped Jedediah to his feet. He was weak, feverish, but conscious enough to move. They slipped through the rocks using the battle as cover, moving toward where they had left the horses. But they didn't make it. A rifle shot cracked. Jedediah felt something massive hit him. Not a graze this time, a full impact. His right shoulder exploded in pain. He went down hard, his body slamming into stone, his consciousness fragmenting. Ayanna was on him instantly, dragging him, pulling him with strength that shouldn't have been possible. She got him to a horse, got him across the saddle, mounted behind him, her arms around his chest, holding him, keeping him from falling. She rode, not away from the fight, toward the border, toward Mexico, toward the last hope they had. Jedediah faded in and out. He was aware of movement, of Ayanna's voice in his ear, speaking words he didn't understand but felt in his bones, of the horse's labored breathing, of pain that filled his entire world. He was dying. He knew that, could feel it, the blood loss, the shock, the way his body was shutting down piece by piece. But Ayanna refused to let him go. She found a place, a narrow pass in the rocks, hidden, defensible. She got him down from the horse, positioned him against a wall, and began to work on his wounds with a desperation that transcended skill. She cut away his shirt, packed the hole in his shoulder with moss and herbs, wrapped it tight enough to slow the bleeding, gave him water, forced him to drink even when he tried to refuse. Then she did something that broke him completely. She took his hand, pressed it to her heart, and made him a promise. She told him she wanted to live as his wife. Not in the white man's church, not according to laws that didn't recognize them as fully human, but according to the old ways, the ways of her people, where commitment was spoken to the wind and the earth and the spirits that watched over all living things. She told him they would survive, would cross into Mexico, would find the free Apache in the mountains, would build a life that honored both their histories and created something new. She told him he didn't have permission to die. Not now. Not after bringing her this far. Not after showing her that the world still held people worth fighting for. Jedediah tried to answer, tried to tell her that he had already died once on the day Margaret burned, and that everything since had been borrowed time, that saving her had been the first real thing he'd done in years, that if he died now, it would be worth it because she would live. But she wouldn't accept it, refused to hear it, told him that lone warriors died alone. But they weren't alone anymore. They were bound, tethered, tied by blood and choice and the debt that souls created when they saved each other. She prayed, not to the Christian God, to the old spirits, the ones her mother had taught her to honor. She called to the four winds, to the Earth Mother, to the warrior spirits of her ancestors. She asked for strength, for time, for mercy in a merciless land. And somehow, impossibly, Jedediah's bleeding slowed, his consciousness steadied, his breathing deepened. Dawn came, pink and gold and beautiful. Ayanna checked their back trail. The fighting had ended. She could see bodies in the distance, both bandits and posse members. The violence had consumed itself, leaving only the dead and the scattered survivors. She helped Jedediah onto the horse one more time. He could barely sit upright, could barely hold on, but he was alive, still breathing, still fighting. They crossed into Mexico as the sun rose fully. No ceremony, no marker, just a line on maps that meant nothing to the desert, but everything to the law. In Mexico, they were no longer fugitives, no longer hunted by the U.S. cavalry, no longer subject to the vengeful justice of territorial vigilantes. They were free, or as free as two wounded, exhausted people could be. Ayanna found a small village, adobe buildings, a priest who asked no questions, women who knew healing. They took Jedediah in, tended his wounds, gave him medicine and time and the space to heal. Weeks passed. His shoulder would never be the same. The bullet had shattered bone, severed muscle, but he lived, healed, slowly regained his strength, and Ayanna never left his side. The village was called San Miguel de las Piedras. It clung to the side of a mountain like a prayer spoken in stone and adobe. The people there had seen enough refugees from the north, both Apache and white, both Mexican and American, that they had learned the wisdom of not asking too many questions. They saw a wounded man and a determined woman and offered what they could: shelter, healing, discretion. The priest, Father Domingo, was a man whose face carried the weathering of decades spent ministering to people caught between impossible choices. He had tended Jedediah's wounds with hands that had clearly done this before, extracting fragments of bone and bullet, cleaning infection, stitching flesh with the precision of someone who understood that bodies were merely vessels, and it was the spirit inside that determined survival. Through it all, Ayanna had remained. She learned the layout of the village quickly, identifying escape routes, defensive positions, sources of water, old habits, warrior training, the kind of vigilance that never truly rested. But she also learned which women knew the healing herbs, which children would bring news of approaching strangers, which men could be trusted to look the other way. Jedediah's recovery was slow. The fever came in waves, burning through him like brush fire, leaving him weak and disoriented. In those moments, he would wake to find Ayanna beside him, her hand cool on his forehead, her voice low and steady, singing songs in her language that he didn't understand but found deeply comforting. She told him stories about her childhood, about learning to track deer with her father, about the ceremonies that marked the seasons, about the oral history of her people, passed down through countless generations, stories that explained how the world came to be and how people should move through it with respect and awareness. He told her about his own childhood, about growing up in Missouri before the violence pushed his family west, about his father's stubborn determination to claim land and build something lasting, about Margaret, who had been born in that western cabin and never known any other life, about the guilt that had followed him like a shadow since the day he found her remains. They were building something in those conversations, not just understanding, a shared history, a foundation. Father Domingo visited often. He spoke English well, having served in Texas before relocating south, and he seemed genuinely interested in their story, or at least, as much of it as they were willing to share. He never pressed, never judged, but his eyes were knowing. He understood what they were fleeing, what they were to each other, what the world thought of such unions. One evening, as Jedediah's strength began to truly return, Father Domingo brought them a meal and sat with them. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone navigating delicate territory. He told them that the village could offer temporary sanctuary, but not permanent safety. Word traveled. Stories spread. There were bounty hunters who worked both sides of the border, men who didn't respect international boundaries when enough money was at stake. Eventually, someone would come asking questions. Eventually, the past would catch up. His advice was to head deeper into the mountains, to the Sierra Madre, to the communities of free Apache who had resisted relocation and removal, who lived in the high places where the Mexican government found it easier to ignore them than to engage. It would be hard, dangerous, but it offered something the border villages could not: true invisibility. Ayana listened intently. This was the plan she had already been forming, the place she had been guiding them toward all along, but hearing it confirmed by someone else gave it weight. Validation. Jedediah asked the question that had been sitting heavy in his chest. Would they be accepted? A white man among Apache refugees? Would his presence put Ayana at greater risk? Father Domingo smiled. It was a sad, knowing expression. He told them that the communities in the mountains were made up of survivors from many bands, people who had lost everything, who had learned that survival sometimes required setting aside old certainties. That blood quantum and cultural purity were luxuries that people being hunted couldn't afford. What mattered was loyalty, commitment, the willingness to contribute and defend. The Free Apache had seen enough mixed families, Mexican and Apache, Spanish and indigenous, white captives who chose to stay, that one more wouldn't raise eyebrows. Especially if that one arrived with Ayana, daughter of a chief bearing her father's sign. Before he left, Father Domingo offered something unexpected: a blessing. He told them he couldn't marry them, not officially, not in the church's eyes, but he could witness their commitment, could speak words over them that acknowledged what they were creating, could give them the small dignity of religious recognition in a world that denied them civil recognition. Jedediah looked at Ayana. She met his gaze steadily. Then she shook her head. Not a rejection, a clarification. She told Father Domingo in her careful Spanish that they appreciated his kindness. But the blessing they needed wasn't from the church. It was from the land, from the spirits, from the witnesses that mattered to her people. Father Domingo nodded. He understood. He left them with supplies for their journey and a small wooden cross, not as a religious object, but as a tool, something they could trade if needed, something that marked them as having passed through his village, under his protection. That night, under a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch, Ayana led Jedediah to a place just outside the village, a small rise where they could see the mountains stretching endlessly to the south. The Sierra Madre, dark shapes against darker sky, promise and danger in equal measure. She told him this was where they would speak their vows, not tomorrow, not when he was fully healed. Now. Because now was all anyone truly had. Because waiting for perfect circumstances was how people lost what mattered. Jedediah stood beside her, his wounded shoulder aching, his body still weak, but his mind clear, clearer than it had been in years. Ayana spoke first. She called to the four directions, to the wind that carried prayers, to the earth that held all stories. She spoke in her own language, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that felt ancient and powerful. Jedediah didn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning, felt them settling into his bones. Then she switched to English, for him. So he would know exactly what she was promising. She told him she chose him, not because he had saved her, but because he had seen her, had treated her not as a savage or a victim, but as a person, as someone whose thoughts mattered, whose skills had value, whose survival was worth risking everything for. She promised to stand with him, to fight beside him, to build whatever life they could build in whatever place would have them. She promised honesty and loyalty and the fierce protection that came from knowing what it meant to have everything torn away. She told him that in her people's tradition, marriage wasn't about ownership or property. It was about two people choosing to walk the same path, to share the same fire, to face the same dangers. And that was what she wanted with him. When she finished, she took his hand and placed it over her heart, just as she had done in the cave when he had been dying, so he could feel the truth of her words, the steady beat that proved she meant every promise. Jedediah was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. He told her he had been dead, had been walking through the world as a ghost for 3 years, had convinced himself that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything, had built his entire life around the principle of avoiding connection because connection meant loss. But she had destroyed that, had shown him that the walls he'd built were a prison, not a protection, that risking everything was the only way to truly have anything. He promised to honor her, to see her not as she had been, the marked prisoner, the fugitive, the victim, but as she was, a warrior, a survivor, a woman of profound strength and deeper courage. He promised to learn, to listen, to try to understand a world he had been raised to believe was savage, but which he now recognized held wisdom his own culture had forgotten. He promised to build whatever life they could create, wherever they could create it, to plant seeds literal and metaphorical, to refuse the destruction that had defined both their pasts, and he promised to remember, to carry the names of those they'd lost, to honor Margaret and Ayana's family by living in ways that would have made them proud. When he finished, he took her hand and brought it to his lips, not a kiss of romance, a gesture of reverence, of respect, of commitment that transcended culture and convention. They stood together on that rise, two people who had every reason to hate each other, who instead had chosen something infinitely more difficult and brave. They had chosen love, not the easy, sanctioned love of people who fit into neat categories, but the dangerous, radical love of people who refused to let the world's violence dictate their hearts. The wind rose around them, warm, carrying the scent of desert sage and distant rain. Ayana whispered that it was a good sign, that the spirits had heard, had witnessed, had blessed. They returned to the village hand in hand. Father Domingo, watching from the doorway of the church, made the sign of the cross. Not in judgment, in acknowledgement, in blessing, despite his church's rules. The next morning they prepared to leave. Jedediah was strong enough to ride. The wounds were healing. The fever had broken. And every day they stayed was a day their pursuers could draw closer. The village women gave Ayana supplies, herbs, dried food, warm blankets woven in patterns that told stories. They spoke to her in Spanish and in fragments of Apache dialects, and she responded with gratitude that transcended language. The men gave Jedediah a better rifle, ammunition, information about the trails that led deep into the Sierra Madre, about which passes were safe and which were controlled by bandits, about where the free Apache communities could be found if you knew how to look. The children gave them both something more precious, hope. They ran around the couple laughing, touching, fascinated by this strange pairing, proof that not everyone had been taught to hate, that innocence still existed, at least in small pockets. As they rode out of San Miguel de las Piedras, heading into the mountains, Jedediah looked back once. The village was already disappearing into the landscape, becoming just another cluster of earth-colored buildings, indistinguishable from the rock and soil. But he would remember, would carry the kindness they had shown, would try to pay it forward in whatever life lay ahead. Ayana didn't look back. Her face was turned toward the mountains, toward home, or what would become home, toward the future they had just vowed to build together. The Sierra Madre rose before them, massive, ancient, indifferent to human drama. But somewhere in those mountains, people like them had found sanctuary, had built lives, had survived. And if they could survive, so could two people bound by grief, commitment, and a love that refused to be erased. The journey would be hard, the destination uncertain, the dangers real and persistent, but they would face it together as husband and wife, as partners, as proof that even in the hardest places, even against the longest odds, hope could take root and grow. They rode into the mountains as the sun climbed high, two figures becoming smaller and smaller against the vast landscape, until they were no longer visible, until they had passed beyond the sight of those who would judge them, into a world where they could finally, truly, be free. 6 months passed. 6 months measured not in calendar days, but in the rhythms of survival and the gradual transformation of two people learning to live as one. The journey into the Sierra Madre had been brutal. Mountain passes so narrow they had to dismount and lead the horses, trails that disappeared without warning, forcing them to backtrack and search for alternatives, cold nights at high altitude where they pressed together for warmth, their breath misting in air so thin it made every task exhausting. But Ayanna had led them true. Using knowledge passed down through generations, she navigated by landmarks invisible to Jedediah's eyes. A particular formation of rock, the way water flowed, the types of trees that marked elevation and direction. She was taking them home, not to the place she had been born, which existed now only in memory and ash, but to the hidden communities of her people who had refused removal, who had chosen hard freedom over comfortable captivity. They found the first settlement 3 weeks into the mountains, a collection of wickiups and small stone structures built into a canyon so well concealed that Jedediah had ridden past it twice before Ayanna pointed it out. Smoke from carefully managed fires rose and dispersed among the trees, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The reception was cautious. Warriors appeared from seemingly nowhere, rifles and bows ready, faces hard with suspicion. A white man was a rare sight here, usually a dangerous one. But Ayanna spoke, in her language, in the dialect of her father's band. She told them who she was, whose daughter. She drew her father's sign in the dust, the firebird, and waited. An old woman emerged from one of the dwellings. She studied Ayanna's face for a long moment, then began to weep. She had known Ayanna's mother, had survived the same massacre by being away gathering herbs. She was the only other survivor of the band. The story of the massacre had already spread through the mountain communities, whispered from settlement to settlement. Another atrocity, another erasure, another reason to stay hidden and vigilant. But Ayanna alive was unexpected, miraculous, proof that sometimes, despite everything, the spirits intervened. The old woman's name was Ithaca. She held Ayanna for a long time, speaking rapidly in their shared language, confirming details, mourning together. Then she turned to Jedediah. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating, seeing far more than his surface. She spoke to Ayanna in a question. Ayanna answered. Ithaca nodded slowly, then surprised Jedediah by speaking English, accented but clear. She told him he was welcome, that any man who would risk his life for one of their daughters had earned consideration. But he would have to prove himself. Words were easy. Actions would tell the truth. That began Jedediah's second education. The first had been learning to survive in the West. This was learning to survive as part of a community that had every reason to distrust him. He worked, hard physical labor that his healing shoulder protested but gradually accepted. He helped build structures, gather wood, hunt game. He learned to move quietly through the forest, to track with subtlety, to understand the patterns of animals and weather. Skills he had possessed as a rancher were refined, deepened, given new context by teachers who had been perfecting them for lifetimes. He learned language, slowly, painstakingly, with Ayanna as his primary teacher and the amused children as his most honest critics. He made countless mistakes, mixed up words that sounded similar but meant completely different things, endured gentle mockery when he accidentally told someone their grandmother was a coyote instead of beautiful. But he persisted, because language was respect, was connection, was the bridge between being a tolerated outsider and being truly part of the community. The breakthrough came during a hunt. Jedediah and 3 Apache warriors were tracking elk through difficult terrain. They had been moving for hours when Jedediah noticed something. A disturbance in the pattern of broken branches, a scent on the wind that didn't fit. He signaled the others, using the hand gestures Ayanna had taught him. They froze, listened, then saw what he had detected, a mountain lion stalking the same elk positioned between the hunters and their prey. The encounter could have been deadly. Mountain lions didn't flee easily, and were most dangerous when surprised. But Jedediah, drawing on instincts honed in years of solitary ranging, read the animal's body language. He slowly raised his rifle, not pointing it at the lion but making it visible. Then he spoke, low, calm, in the Apache language, telling the lion they meant no challenge, that there was elk enough for all, that they could share the mountain without blood. The lion watched them, yellow eyes evaluating. Then, impossibly, it turned and faded back into the rocks, leaving the elk to the human hunters. The warriors stared at Jedediah. One of them, a man named Nietzsche, who had been particularly skeptical of the white man's presence, finally smiled. He told Jedediah that perhaps he had Apache blood somewhere in his ancestry, that only people who truly understood the mountain could speak to its predators and be heard. It was a joke, but also not. It was acceptance. That night, around the communal fire, Nietzsche told the story, embellishing it slightly, making the lion bigger and more fierce, making Jedediah's calm more impressive. The community listened, and something shifted. The white man wasn't just Ayanna's rescued project. He was becoming one of them. Ayanna watched from beside Jedediah, her hand resting on his. She was changing too. The haunted look that had filled her eyes since the massacre was slowly being replaced by something else. Not forgetting, she would never forget, but integrating, finding a way to carry her grief without being crushed by it. She was teaching, passing on her mother's knowledge of plants and healing, working with the women to prepare hides, to create clothing and tools. Her hands were constantly busy, creating, maintaining, building, and her body was changing in another way, a way that both terrified and thrilled her. She waited until she was certain before telling Jedediah. 3 months into their time in the mountains, they were alone, gathering water from a spring, when she took his hand and placed it on her belly. At first, he didn't understand. Then he did. His eyes widened. His face went through a series of expressions too quick to name. Shock, fear, joy, terror again. Then settling into something like wonder. He started to speak, started to ask a dozen questions, but she stopped him with a finger on his lips. She told him she knew this was unexpected, that they were still building their own survival, that bringing a child into this uncertain world was perhaps foolish, but she wanted this, wanted the life growing inside her, wanted to create something new from all the destruction they had both endured, wanted to prove that even in the hardest places, even after the worst violence, something beautiful could grow. Jedediah knelt beside her at the spring, pressed his forehead to her belly, and made a promise to protect them both, to build something lasting, to be the father he had never expected to become, to raise their child to know both worlds, the Apache traditions of its mother and the frontier pragmatism of its father. To teach it survival, yes, but also hope. Ayanna ran her fingers through his hair, the gesture both tender and possessive. She told him she had chosen well, that their child would be strong, would carry the blood of survivors on both sides, would be a bridge between worlds that desperately needed bridging. The community's reaction to the pregnancy was overwhelmingly positive. Children were precious. Each new life was a defiance of the forces trying to eliminate them. Ithaca was particularly joyful, seeing in this baby a continuation of Ayanna's mother's line, a thread unbroken despite the massacre. The women began preparing, creating a cradle board in the traditional style, gathering special herbs for the birth, teaching Jedediah what would be expected of him, how to support Ayanna through labor, what rituals would mark the child's arrival, how to protect mother and baby in the vulnerable first weeks. As Ayanna's belly grew, so did Jedediah's sense of purpose. He had spent years after Margaret's death believing he had nothing left to protect. Now he had everything. A wife who was also a warrior, a child coming into a dangerous world, a community that had accepted him against all odds. He built them a dwelling. Not a wickiup, which was temporary, but something more permanent. A small cabin constructed of stone and timber, using techniques from both cultures. It had the defensive positioning and natural integration Ayanna preferred, but also the enclosed space and storage Jedediah's background valued. It became a symbol, a physical representation of what they were creating, something neither fully Apache nor fully white, something new, something that honored both traditions while being beholden to neither. Winter came to the mountains. Snow fell deep and pure, transforming the landscape into something pristine and deadly beautiful. The community prepared as they had for generations, gathering supplies, insulating structures, preparing for months when travel would be nearly impossible, and survival would depend on careful preparation. Jedediah and Ayanna's cabin became a gathering place. Perhaps because it was new, perhaps because Jedediah's outsider status made people less formal around him, perhaps because Ayanna's storytelling gift, inherited from her mother, drew people in. They would sit around the fire while snow fell outside, and Ayanna would tell the old stories. Creation myths, trickster tales, histories of heroes, and lessons of survival. Jedediah would sometimes contribute stories from his own tradition, folk tales from Missouri, frontier legends, stories that surprised the community with their similarities to their own teachings. One night, Ithaca told Jedediah something he would never forget. She said that the white men who came west brought books that spoke of conquest and destiny, of taming wilderness and civilizing savages. But what they never understood was that the wilderness didn't need taming. It needed respect. And the people they called savages had been civilized long before European ships touched these shores. She told him that his people had technology and weapons, but her people had time, had patience, had the kind of knowledge that came from living in relationship with the land rather than in dominance over it, and that any future worth having would require both kinds of wisdom. Jedediah understood he was being given a gift, not just acceptance, but teaching. Ithaca was passing on understanding that most white men never received. She was trusting him with knowledge, with perspective, with the responsibility of carrying multiple truths. The baby came with the first thaw. Spring was announcing itself, snow melting into rushing streams, green returning to the world, when Ayanna's labor began. It was long, difficult, frightening in the way all births are frightening, the reminder that life and death are closer than breathing. Jedediah stayed with her, holding her hand, providing whatever support he could while the experienced women did the actual work of helping her through. When the baby finally arrived, crying with impressive volume, healthy and strong, Jedediah wept, not quietly, not with restraint, but openly, releasing years of grief and fear and hope he had kept locked inside. A girl, their daughter, perfect and tiny and impossible. Ayanna held her, exhausted and triumphant, and whispered her name. Nijoni, beautiful in all ways. A name that carried blessing and hope. The community celebrated for 3 days, music and food, and the kind of joy that people who live under constant threat learn to embrace fully when it appears. Every child was a victory. This child, daughter of Ayanna and the white man who loved her, was a particular kind of victory. Proof that bridges could be built, that new futures were possible. Jedediah sat with his daughter in his arms, watching Ayanna sleep the deep sleep of new mothers, and felt something he hadn't felt since before Margaret died. Contentment, not happiness, which was too light a word, but the deep, bone-level satisfaction of knowing his life had meaning. Purpose, direction. They had survived the hanging tree, the flight across the territory, The violence of men who believed their hate was righteous, the brutal journey into mountains that killed the unprepared, and they had done more than survive. They had built something, created something, brought new life into a world that specialized in death. In the months that followed, Jedediah watched Ayanna transform again. Motherhood suited her. She was fierce and gentle in equal measure, teaching Nijoni from the first breath how to be strong, how to survive, how to love the world despite its dangers. He built them a life, a real life, not just survival but something with texture and meaning. He helped expand the community's defenses, taught them some of his tracking techniques while learning theirs, became a bridge himself, the one who could move between the Apache world and, when necessary, the white world below. Because supplies were still needed, trade was still necessary, and someone who could navigate both cultures without immediate suspicion was valuable. He made trips down the mountain, carefully, rarely, always changing his appearance, his story, his approach. He traded furs and craftwork for ammunition, tools, fabric. He gathered news from the territories, learned which areas were still dangerous, which had stabilized, which were best avoided. He heard stories about himself sometimes, the rancher who had disappeared, the man suspected of helping the Apache fugitive. Most people assumed he was dead, killed by the same bandits that had attacked Prescott's posse. Some said he'd fled to California. Others said Mexico proper. No one guessed he was living in the Sierra Madre, married to an Apache woman, raising a daughter who would grow up speaking 3 languages and belonging fully to none of the world's neat categories. 2 years passed, then 3. Nizoni grew from infant to toddler, to a child who could run and laugh and ask questions in both Apache and English, mixing them freely, creating her own language from the 2 worlds she inhabited. Jedediah's hair showed more gray. His shoulder never quite healed right, aching in cold weather, limiting his range of motion. But he was alive, healthy, part of something larger than himself. Ayanna remained the center of his world. They fought sometimes, the inevitable friction of 2 strong-willed people learning to share space and decisions. But they always returned to each other, always remembered what they had survived to be together, always chose each other over easier alternatives. The community prospered as much as any community living outside the law could prosper. Children were born. Old people died peacefully, which in itself was a victory. Knowledge was passed down, stories were told and retold, evolving slightly with each telling, becoming the foundation for future generations. And in the small stone cabin that blended both cultures, a family lived. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but authentically, genuinely, with a kind of love that could only be forged in fire and hardship. One evening, sitting outside their home watching the sun set over mountains that stretched forever, Ayanna leaned against Jedediah's shoulder. Nijoni played nearby, creating elaborate stories with stones and sticks, her imagination vast and unbounded. Ayanna spoke quietly. She told Jedediah that her father would have approved, would have seen in him what she saw, a man who chose principle over comfort, who honored commitments over convenience, who understood that the world's divisions were artificial and could be transcended by those brave enough to try. She told him that her mother would have loved Nijoni, would have taught her the songs that Ayanna was now teaching her, would have passed on the stories that connected their family to ancestors stretching back into time beyond memory. She told him she was happy, that despite everything they had lost, everything they had survived, everything that remained dangerous and uncertain, she was happy. Jedediah pulled her closer, pressed his lips to her hair, and told her the truth he had learned in the years since cutting her down from that tree. He told her that salvation wasn't something that came from outside, wasn't something given by governments or churches or the approval of society. It was something people created for themselves, through choice, through commitment, through the daily work of building something worth having. They had saved each other, not just from physical death, but from the spiritual death of living as ghosts, haunted by past failures, unable to imagine future hope. And in saving each other, they had created something that the world insisted was impossible. A love that crossed every boundary, A family that defied every category. A life that proved quietly but definitively that the human heart was larger than the world's hatreds. As darkness fell and stars emerged, brilliant in the thin mountain air, they sat together. 3 people, a family, a testament to the power of choosing love over law, compassion over convention, hope over hate. The world below continued its violence, continued its divisions, continued insisting that some people were worth less than others, that some loves were forbidden, that some lives didn't matter. But on the mountain, in a hidden canyon where the free Apache had created sanctuary, 2 survivors and their daughter proved the world wrong, every single day, not through grand gestures or dramatic protests, but through the simple, radical act of living, of loving, of refusing to let the world's cruelty define what was possible. The Firebird still lived, was living, would continue to live in Nijoni and whatever children she might one day have, the symbol of resilience, of rising from ashes, of refusing extinction. And beside that Firebird, a white man's handprint in the dust, still visible, still present, a pledge kept, a promise honored, a love that had survived everything meant to destroy it. The story could have ended in violence, in separation, in the erasure the world intended. But instead, it ended here, in peace, in family, in the quiet triumph of 2 people who looked at the world's impossibilities and said, simply, no. We will love anyway. We will live anyway. We will build anyway. And they did, they had, they would. For as long as mountains stood and rivers ran and hearts chose courage over fear, their story would whisper itself into existence. A reminder, a promise, a truth. That love, real love, the kind forged in fire and sealed in sacrifice, was stronger than any force meant to destroy it. And that was enough, more than enough, it was everything.